How does the nil rate band work for inheritance tax? Hi, I'm Kimberly Shapcotts, qualified chartered accountant, property investor and entrepreneur. Let's sit down and have a chat. Inheritance tax is going to come to most of us as property investors, and the reason we say that is because the hope is that our estates are going to be over the 325,000 or 650,000 for a couple. However, that is not that much money when you are looking at investing in property, and hopefully at some point you'll own the equity in all of those properties. However, one thing that is available as part of the inheritance tax legislation is something called the nil rate band. And the nil rate band is something that increases that 325,000 by an additional 175,000. But this all relates to your main residence. So today we're going to have a dive into an example so you can see exactly how the nil rate band works and how potentially your property will fit into your inheritance tax estate for taxing and calculating how much it's going to be when that time comes in your life, so that we can see exactly what you will be paying and what will be included, what won't be included, which allows you to do some planning to see what you may need to do with any of your assets, your investments, your cash, to mitigate any inheritance tax that may become payable on your demise. So let's dive into the nil rate band calculation and see how we can potentially be making the most of this additional 175,000, which for a couple can take it up to 500,000 per person or up to the million. That would be then tax free under the inheritance tax allowances and nil rate band. Let's jump into our examples, and we've got 3 examples today, one of which is at the allowances, one which is below the allowances and one which is over the allowances, so you can see how it all fits together. Our first example is going to be one where we have Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs and their house is worth 350,000, which funnily enough means that our 175,000 is the value that each of them has for their personal property. As a family, they have some investment properties which are owned jointly, some mortgages on those properties, they've got some cash and savings, and they've also got some pensions which will fall within the estate after 2027. As they're going to be living past 2027, we are going to incorporate them into our calculations at this point in time. This means that overall they've got an estate of 648,250 each, and the first thing we then need to look at is our nil rate band. Now, for our nil rate band, we need to consider whether the residence nil rate band is the lower of the property value and 175,000. So as you can see on screen, we've got our nil rate band of 175,000 and our property value is also 175,000, which ultimately means that between the two of them, it's going to be 175,000. So jumping back up to our calculation, we can see that we've got 648,250 take off our 165,000. We then also have our inheritance tax allowance, which is 325,000 that we can utilise. So that means the estate that is taxable is going to be 148,250 to give us a tax payable at 40% without any further planning or any changes of just under 60,000, the 59,300. There may be some planning opportunities for this family, there may be some other options, but as we can see here, based on their current property, they are fully utilising their nil rate band and maximising what they can do with this part of the allowance. Let us move across to our second example. And our second example is one where the house value has a lower value. And on this one, Mr. and Mrs. Bloggs number 2 are going to have a property that's only worth 150,000. Now this means that for each of them, as it's owned jointly, that means it will be at 75,000 per person. Now 75,000 per person has now reduced the estate for each of them down to 548,000, as we've kept everything else the same with their investment portfolio with 5 properties, we've got some cash and savings, and we've got their pension still sitting there. So this means when we come to do our calculation for what our nil rate band allowance is, we need to consider what is the lower of the property value and the 175,000 allowance. And as we can see here, we've got our nil rate band of 175,000 and our property value of 75,000, which means that our nil rate band is restricted to the 75,000. Now, our residence nil rate band will be 75, our inheritance tax allowance will be 325. So overall for each of these individuals, the maximum that they have allowances for is 400,000. So jumping back onto our calculation, we've got our 548,250 estate value. We take off our nil rate band of 75,000. We can also take off our inheritance tax of 325,000, which yet again still leaves us with an estate that is taxable of 148,250. And oddly enough, our inheritance tax at 40% is still just under 60,000 at 59,300. So as you can see here, actually, when we're fully utilising our nil rate band or when the property value is lower, the inheritance tax for all the rest of our assets, our estate, is actually going to be relatively similar, or the same in fact. So from this point of view, the primary residence doesn't have a bearing on what the inheritance tax is going to be, assuming that the value of that property is going to maximise the 175,000. Let us jump over to our final example where we actually now have a property that's worth more than our allowance and see how that one fits together. So in this example, we now have a property that's worth 500,000. So with the property worth 500,000, that means that we've got 250,000 per person, with it being owned 50-50. Yet again, we're going to keep the whole of the rest of the estate the same, with our 5 investment properties and mortgages, some cash and savings, and our pension assets. Now this means that for our final example, we've got estate values worth 723,250. Now we can go back to our little part at the bottom and look at what is the lower of our property value and our 175,000 allowance. And our property value in this position is 250,000 and our nil rate band is 175,000. So in our example here, we are now maximising that 175,000, and we have the 175,000 nil rate band, we have our inheritance tax allowance of 325,000. So overall, in this individuals will have 1 million or 500,000 each allowances available. So let's see what the impact on the inheritance tax is now. So we have our total estate value of 723,250. We take off our nil rate band of 175,000. We take off our inheritance tax allowance of 325,000. So now our taxable value is going to be 223,250, which gives us an inheritance tax charge of 89,300 because of the 40% tax rate. As you can see, now we've got a property over the value of the nil rate band. We have maximised what we can do with our nil rate band and also our inheritance tax allowances. This therefore means for this family, the question would be, is there any other inheritance tax planning opportunities to just make sure that potentially cash has been passed to others, or other such examples such as selling a property, realising the property, paying any capital gains tax, and passing any cash on to future generations or family and friends as appropriate to reduce the value of their estate before something happens to them. So there is a few different opportunities, and it's just a matter of having a look through how this is going to impact you to make sure you're minimising any inheritance tax that may be payable on your demise or on your family member's demise, to minimise the impact of what is going to be left behind for any other family members. As you can see there, with one example showing you where the nil rate band is not fully utilised and another showing you where it is fully utilised. So it is not a given that you will definitely get up to the 500,000, and you probably just need to do some sums to check based on where you are today whether you'll be getting the full allowance or whether you'll be looking at being short of that allowance. It's a great additional benefit to help mitigate inheritance tax, but again, a little bit of planning and hopefully you can minimise any inheritance tax that may be payable by you or your family. Hopefully today you've discovered how the nil rate band fits with the inheritance tax allowances. If you have any questions, then please do leave a comment. Please like the video and do subscribe to the channel, and let's make tax less taxing.